Can you guys hear me okay? If you can't, it might be because my sweater is too loud, so I'll try to... I got it, in sort of a second-hand place. I think it was made for a very round, older woman, as far as I can tell. It doesn't fit exactly, but I hope you get the spirit of it. How you guys doing? You look great. No, you do. You look great. Let's see, so you look great, my sweater. Touch, I want to talk about teaching touch. So touch is kind of a big deal in the last couple of years, right? I'm really excited about the possibilities of it because I think that it really changes the way that we, both as designers as well as consumers, as the users of this software, have to think about software and sort of hold the mental model in our heads. I think that it forces, or should force, really big changes in the way that we think about the interfaces that we design. I suspect that, at least on touchscreen devices, these new touch interactions are going to sweep away decades of tabs and folders and menus and buttons to sort of bring together a whole new sort of interaction metaphor that we're only just beginning to explore. I'd like to talk about that a little bit now. When we get rid of this thing, this sort of prosthetic that we've been using to point at stuff for 25 years, which introduces this layer of abstraction between us and the content, when you get rid of that, all that's left is you and the device, or you and the content. That's the illusion that we have the opportunity to create here, right? I mean, interfaces are all illusion. It's all sort of smoke and mirrors. But the more that you can create this illusion that you're interacting directly with content as a physical object, the more that we can tickle the brain in kind of new ways. And this is a big shift. It's a real change in the way that we think about interface design. But I think it's a challenge not only for us as software designers, but also for users. Because we're teaching a whole new gesture vocabulary, a whole new way to manipulate content. There's some really obvious stuff, it's like things that look like physical objects that you can drag around the screen. People figure that out immediately. But what about for more complex interactions? How do people figure out how to use these things? How do we teach touch, in other words? First I should say, what's the big idea? What's the big deal? What's the problem about this, right? Touch, on one hand, lets us do all kinds of new UI tricks and stunts and sort of play with content and data in new ways. I think also sort of more important, it also replaces something that the desktop GUI that frankly I think feels sort of wrong on touch screens, and particularly larger touch screens. The Mail app for iPad, I think, shows how sometimes traditional controls can feel really cramped on larger touch screens. So you've got this tiny button in the top left, right, of iPad apps. It's not easy enough to hit, but I'm asked to hit it all the time. And so lots of iPad apps follow this model. It's called the split view, where you tap that button to bring over a little pop-over menu. So say I'm reading this lovely, generous email from Facebook telling me about my friends' birthdays, but I want to go back out to my sent mail, right? I have to hit this whole series of little buttons and tap targets that are sort of hard to hit, that take a fair amount of concentration now on this expansive big screen. It makes me a little bit cranky sometimes, I'm always asked to hit this tiny little button when I've got this huge, expansive screen to be able to hit. Now, Fitts' law comes into play here. I suspect many of you know what Fitts' law is, but quickly. It's based on a model to describe how long it takes to move an object to a target, a physical object, using some sort of prosthetic or pointer. Imagine a shuffleboard stick moving a puck to a target. And it boils down to a pretty common sense conclusion. This is the Fitts' law part, which is the further away and the smaller a target is, the harder it is to hit. This is what makes golf such a miserable sport. Fitts' law. Turns out Fitts' law also works for touch screens, even though you're not using one of these sort of pointers, but your actual finger, direct interaction. And it maps even better the larger the touch screen gets. So for the iPad, you see that going on here too, right? On phones, the problem isn't as pronounced. Any target is within quick reach of a sweep of your thumb. But on the iPad, you're dragging your whole arm, this giant meat pointer, all the way up into the corner. And it takes both effort, physical effort, ergonomics, and concentration. So it's cognitively and physically more difficult to hit these little buttons. So those same buttons, even though they're the same size on the iPhone as on the iPad, they're much harder to hit on the iPad, both, as I said, cognitively and ergonomically. It takes concentration and effort. And this should be our mantra as designers. Let me be as lazy as I want to be. Don't make me concentrate on hitting little buttons. Don't make me swipe at the whole screen. Or let me swipe at the whole screen instead of just a little tiny plot of it. Do you even need buttons at all for your app? Sort of a simple example, again from the iPad. This is called Pinball HD. And it's a pinball game without any buttons. I mean, imagine, it's like, we have specific associations with pinball and buttons, right? I mean, that's how you work these things. In this case, there's no buttons at all, or really more to the point, the entire screen is a button. 2 buttons, really. Tap anywhere on the left side of the screen to trigger these flippers, tap anywhere on the right side to trigger these flippers, and just pull down on the plunger to sort of make it go. I think it's worth thinking, where are the opportunities to eliminate buttons? I'll follow through on that thought in a second. But first I want to say, it's not that buttons are evil, or that we should never use them. And particularly as we continue to develop a gesture vocabulary, as we teach people and become accustomed to ourselves at what emerging conventions are going to be like for gestures, visual buttons and labels will remain useful, and also for abstract actions. I don't know what the gesture is for send to Twitter. I don't know what gesture we should use for that. So sometimes a button is going to be helpful for that, a really labeled, explicit kind of item. But that doesn't mean that we can't also have alternatives. So finally, right, in iOS 5 for iPad, we have shortcuts. For this thing that I hate so much with the back button, I can just sort of swipe out that thing anywhere on the screen to pull out that thing. It's a very coarse gesture that lets me use the entire screen as a control without having that kind of precision. Now, gestures are the keyboard shortcuts of touch interfaces. They let you get around the button press. So keep the button, but give me gestures like this. Think about what a 2 or 3 finger swipe might do as a shortcut. A 5-finger touch. Now, it's important to realize that not everybody has 5 fingers, so you kind of can't rely on this stuff to be the only way to do something. But as a shortcut to a visible action, these are things that we need to introduce more and more into our app, sort of backup plans. Again, this is an optional shortcut, a supplement to the button. You see another example like that here in Reader for iPad. Reader's a Google Reader app. It lets you read your news feeds. And say that you're in here looking at one particular feed, and you want to go back to your whole list of all of the feeds. Well, there's a back button here for that. That, of course, is something that I hate with the heat of a million suns. So what's sort of easier? They give a secondary gesture, which lets you just pinch the thing closed. So again, this is this coarse gesture that just lets you slap at the screen very quickly. It gives sort of more fluidity to your app. It's not a replacement for the button, but it's a supplement. Big screens invite big gestures. You don't have to hit the little button. Let me sort of swipe or paw at the entire screen to take an action. Been talking about this in terms of sort of ergonomic point of view, sort of, this is hard to hit, makes me think too much. But there's also a conceptual problem about buttons. Buttons are a hack. I don't say that in any sort of pejorative sense. I just mean that they are workarounds. This is true in the real world as well as in the virtual world. A light switch over here to turn on a light over there is not obvious. It's not intuitive. It's something that has to be taught. It's a connection that works at a distance. This is why I spend more time than I care to admit in other people's bathrooms in the dark trying to figure out what their light switch is, right? I know where the light is, but the link between the switch and the light isn't obvious. It's a lot better than the alternative, which would be to walk into a dark room with a ladder and climb up and operate the thing directly. So buttons are an inspired hack, right? They're a workaround that we, through our human ingenuity, created to get around this sort of obstinate problem of not being able to work directly with the content. And that's what the desktop interface was about, right? Here's sort of a bunch of visible things, switches, buttons, things that we've learned from the physical world that now we can put in as abstractions to work on other objects. But it's rarely working on the primary object, manipulating the content itself, right? So while touch lets us, as I said earlier, tickle the brain in kind of new ways, touching a button is not that, right? It's something more about working with the content itself. So again, I'm not saying that buttons are evil or bad. It's just that our brains evolved to navigate physical space, to work directly with objects. And so sort of before going into some examples, I just want to urge you broadly not to get trapped by these temporary alternate universe of the GUI that we've had just for 30 years. Designed for humans, designed for direct interaction. Think about the physicality of things that you can design for when you're designing for touch. I should mention that even Microsoft is getting this religion, right? From the demos that we've seen so far, Windows 8 is going to be a touch interface. All touch and gestures. UI inspired by Windows Phone and Zune. You remember Zune, the little poop-colored MP3 player. It was sort of a bust as a product, but it had some interesting interface ideas that I think are carried through into Windows Phone now. You're swiping through panels of content. Look at the way that you go through apps. You just swipe from the side to switch apps. Now, we'll see how this pans out. They're going to sort of mash it together with old school Windows, so you're going to have, you're going to swipe through it, and all of a sudden you're going to be in an Excel spreadsheet, and good luck touch controlling that, right? So there's going to be a little bit of a Frankenstein period here. We'll see how it goes. But I think the fact that Microsoft is making Windows touch Windows really suggests that we're turning a corner here in the way that we think about interfaces and design them. In a very big and mainstream way, we're moving away from an old notion of graphical UI, of menus and buttons. So what does this mean practically? How do we think about designing interfaces without buttons? Well, a really simple example comes to us from Twitter for iPad, where they've got rid of the back button entirely, right? It's all sort of coarse gestures of swiping through your history. So one of the great things about Twitter is how deeply you can explore through your stream, right? So if we're here and we click on a tweet, that panel slides over, and it sort of shows me a new panel that represents that tweet that I just did, including sort of secondary content, one of the links inside. And I can click and sort of tap within the other links there. And so here I am still. Here's that original tweet, and here's sort of where I am now. Again, looking at sort of secondary information, in this case, the profile of somebody who's in there. I want to find out what she's been talking about lately, so I click on her tweets. Tap on her tweets, excuse me. And so this is all sort of now moving over, right? We've got now a stack of slices of content here, where there's no back button, but just each slice of your history is represented by a panel that moves. So I can swipe back to kind of go back in, or just continue drilling in, right? So the thing about this is now something that replaces that little button with this really easy to understand coarse gesture of moving through your history like cards. Again, big screens invite big gestures. Here's another example, an experiment, sort of a doodle really, put together by a designer named Moritz Harman. It's a demo that he created using the IKEA catalog content as sort of base material to show what navigating content without controls would be. It's in the emulator here, so it's with a cursor instead of a finger, but you get the idea. As you sort of tap on each piece of content itself, again, no controls or buttons, the history sort of zooms in and out. As you go further away from, the past state moves back out. And it's something that feels a little bit unusual at first, but then as you get the hang of it, you're like, actually, this feels completely natural. That it's sort of like navigating a landscape where things move into the distance as you get further away from it. You can sort of drill right down into the content itself just by touching it. This is all to say that sometimes designing for touch means that we need to turn familiar abstractions on their head. So this is TouchUp for iPad. And it's basically an app that lets you paint on filters onto photos, essentially. So the most sort of the easiest, simplest example of this is putting a color on, right? Which you, of course, paint on with your finger. What if you want a different size brush? I mean, we know how to solve that problem, right? You have some sort of button or settings where a palette shows up, where you choose a brush size or maybe a slider to change the brush size. The thing is, you already have a brush, and it doesn't change size. right? So sort of changing the size of what that footprint is going to be on the screen is something that was making me unsure what's going to happen. I have uncertainty about what's going to happen when I touch the screen. I'm sort of processing that layer of abstraction of what the touch point is going to do. So what TouchUp does instead is it lets you, instead of change the brush size, change the canvas size. And then you can draw again, and your finger stays the same size. So you're sort of zooming in and out of the picture rather than sort of artificially changing your brush size. So when you deal with touch, you have to rethink some of these familiar abstractions, to think in sort of new ways, which of course inevitably brings me to sort of some old ways, including this awesome Swiss Army knife. Ladies and gentlemen, the Wenger Giant. You may have seen a picture of this thing. It sort of makes the rounds sometimes, but it's actually a real honest-to-God knife. No Photoshop shenanigans. This is the Guinness World Record holder for most multifunctional pen knife. 87 tools amounting to over 140 functions. It's got a golf reamer in here, and it's a cigar cutter. There's a laser pointer. My personal favorite is the key ring. You're not going to lose those again. So this thing is obviously ridiculous, but intentionally so. Something that was made for the 100th anniversary of the Wenger Company, one of the two companies that makes the official Swiss Army knife. And their idea was, let's, for our 100th anniversary, take every gadget that we've ever put into a Swiss Army knife and make one bitchin' Swiss Army knife. And this is it. So it's a bit of humor and whimsy from the Swiss. But as a knife, it's sort of a failure, right? It's a pocket knife that won't fit in your pocket. I mean, the usability problems here are kind of obvious. Please don't use the toothpick. But there is sort of something that I want to make clear from this, which is that in a mobile interface, which this certainly is, clarity should always trump density. Just the fact that you have to go through 87 tools to find the one you want is going to be an exercise in frustration, right? So better to have less of a dense collection at any one point and be able to find the tool that you want. So clarity always trumps density. Now, this is one of our challenges as software designers a lot of times. In most interfaces, the more features that you have, the more controls you need. Sort of too much in a small space makes things ergonomically unsuited to its purpose, like this, right? So a wonderful thing about touch gestures is that they can let us remove Chrome, replace particularly sort of power features, replace the buttons that trigger those things, and let us manipulate things more directly with touch. But that leaves a giant question. This is the question that you asked earlier. Is how do you find the damn thing? Gestures are invisible. They don't have labels like buttons do, right? It's not clear where things are, especially for sort of abstract gestures. The more that a gesture resembles a physical action, the more people will get it. You see this all the time in user testing. If it looks like a physical object, people will interact with it like one. They'll also interact with it if it works the same as it does on the desktop. So people figure out quickly in Google Maps, for example, that you can double tap to go into the map, even though that has no sort of physical relationship, but they know it from the desktop. The double click and the double tap kind of works together. But so newcomers will figure that out right away. But they'll never figure out in iOS, for example, in the Maps app, that a two-finger single touch will zoom you out. Why would they figure that out? It's not obvious. It has nothing to do with the desktop or the physical world. It's something that strictly has to be taught. So people will figure out stuff that works from known experience, either on the desktop or with the real world. So we can train people by using conventions that they already understand. And one way to do that, as we'll see, is using sort of realistic 3D interfaces. But understand, too, that with a little bit of help, people will learn to use more abstract and invisible gestures. I mean, we do this all the time. We use interfaces daily that are essentially invisible, or at least in the dark. I mean, right? It's like a lot of us can actually turn this thing off in our sleep. Who, by the way, wakes up to that noise at all? Does that just give you a heart attack? Sorry about that. Sometimes people have a seizure when I play that specific sound that they wake up to. Sorry about that. Just want to make sure you're up. So the thing is, it's like muscle memory, right? After a certain amount of time, in your sleep you can do this gesture of pounding that button, even though it's not only in the dark, but you weren't even conscious. I mean, it's like typing. Look at all of you with keyboards, right? It turns out that if you ask professional typists, which I guess we all are now, to write down the order of keys on the keyboard, almost nobody can do it. It's not even in your conscious knowledge now, right? It's all muscle memory. It's all something where, as you type, it's just intent fluidly transferred to action. We don't look at the labels, right? I mean, you start there. This is sort of this is the end point that we want to get people to, right? It's just sort of fluid use of the app without even looking at needing labels. It's, you know where everything is. The problem with these examples, right, is that both with the clock and with the keyboard, we had to start with those button labels, right? We needed those visible cues to learn how to do it before it could actually go into our muscle memory. So we always start with visible cues, you know? Nearly everything we know has to be taught and learned and observed. So before we get to helping people find those invisible gestures, I do want to talk about the importance of visual cues. This is the OCD cutting board for obsessive compulsive chefs. And it's something where if you want to really make sure that you got it exactly right, you know, your julienne cut or your allumette cut, this has like all the marks, so you can really just get them precise. And this is a cheat sheet, right? This means that if you don't yet have this in muscle memory, if you don't know sort of exactly, sort of by instinct, what these things should be, you have a cheat sheet, a guide. We surround ourselves by these things all the time. A conscious set of tools, or maybe personal organization systems. Other times, though, there's softer reminders, often social, and not entirely in our control as either designers or consumers. Don Norman had a new book out this year in January called Living with Complexity. If you know Norman's work, a lot of it will be sort of familiar. It's sort of ideas from a lot of his other books, but sort of brought together and updated with some fresh examples. One of the things he talks about is salt and pepper shakers. Who thinks that this one is pepper? Salt? Who has no idea? Right, so it's about a third of each or so, I would say. Don makes the point that it actually doesn't matter what the correct answer is. It only matters what the person who filled them thinks, right? I mean, that's why even if you're sure, I know this is salt, I know this is pepper, you still test it, don't you? Right? Because you don't have confidence in the system. Even though you know what you believe is right, you don't have confidence. So you have to slow down and figure that out. These are social conventions, arbitrarily defined, unevenly understood. And this is where we are with touch gestures right now. Only we're the ones filling the salt and pepper shakers, right? I mean, a two-finger swipe over here does something different than on this app over here. And so we're in a position where we as designers are trying to figure out where the salt goes, and our users are certainly kind of confused about it. But our job as hosts, as the people filling the salt and pepper shakers, is to remove that uncertainty, right? So you see this in salt and pepper shakers, sort of this development of more helpful labels, you know, so that it removes the uncertainty. But what's better than a label? How about this? The content itself. Now I know what I'm going to get, right? There's no sort of parsing of another, you know, dots or letters. This is internationally understood. Understand, though, that this is still a social convention. And you're going to be surprised if this is sugar, right? But it's still a better understood one. You know, so it's still a convention that you're using. This is using content as the interface. Content is the control. Information is the interface. You know, this is more getting at what we have the opportunity to do with touch interfaces. And you do see it a lot. I mean, the sort of photo galleries are a great example of this. Really dense information display with very little chrome or controls. You know, you want this photo? Just tap it. There it is. Now again, this sort of very obvious visual cues of the salt and pepper shakers, of the thumbnails, these are invitations to tap, right? This still doesn't cover that problem of how do we teach people to do more abstract gestures. Well, so a lot of times what we do is we fall back to instructions, right? For the iPad, when you go to the Popular Science app, this is the screen that you get, a long list of gestures and instructions for how to read this magazine. Read a magazine. New Yorker, similar thing. A lot of apps do this. The problem is twofold. One is you're asking people to sort of take in the whole range of controls for how to run the app before they've even tried it, before they even know what it can do for you. So on the one hand, it's premature, but it also makes it seem a lot more complicated than it is, right? I mean, you don't need to know all the advanced features and sort of secret things to read a magazine. So Coy Vin, the director of New York Times Digital, sort of took a little poke at this stuff by putting together his version of this for what it would look like for a real print magazine. Pages stacked on the left side display your reading history. This is unread content here. And by the way, page corners can be folded over to remember where you left off. But look, doesn't this make it look complicated? It's something that is not welcoming. It's a barrier. You know, so it seems more complicated than it actually is. Norwegian TV had a comedy sketch many years ago titled Medieval Help Desk. Now, can you guys read the captions in the back? Probably not. I'll read them out loud as we go here. Here's the setup. The book has just been invented, and so scroll readers everywhere are in panic and confusion as they try to figure out this new technology. So this monk has just brought in the help desk to help him figure out how to do the book. We'll come in the middle here where he's just gotten a tutorial and he thinks he's got it. He says, and he explains, he's sort of apologizing. When you're used to paper scrolls, it takes some time to figure out how to turn the pages of a book.
Litt grann tid å konvertere til å bla I en bøk.
All right, so everything's okay?
Ja,
just one last thing. Let's run through it once before you leave. All right, so I open it like this, and then how'd you say?
Jeg blar.
You turn the page.
Blar.
All right, I turn the page back and forth, and when I'm finished, I just close it.
Og når jeg ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den. Flott.
Nice, thank you. Great. See ya. Oh wait, I can't believe it. It's like this again. I can't open it. You're doing it with the wrong side. You're doing it the wrong side. What do you mean wrong? You have to open it from the other side.
Åpne fra den siden der. Sånn. Der. Der nå.
I see. Have you read the manual? The manual? Yeah, it comes with this guide for users. Here it is. But that's the same problem. I can't open it. We hadn't thought of that. Look, even if the guy could have figured out how to read the manual, he wouldn't have, because we never read manuals. All of us have this really imperfect knowledge of the tools that we use every day because we're unwilling to read the manuals. It's also why most people think that Monopoly is this long, tortuous game that never seems to end, because we don't read the instructions. If you actually read the instructions, it's a pretty quick little game, and it sort of works just right. But here's the problem. This doesn't seem like an evening of fun. I mean, why don't we read instructions? We don't read instructions because we're impatient. We have a goal. Either we want to get something done with the software we're using, or we just want to get to the action, get to the play. So instructions always feel like a diversion from our goal, even if reading them would help us get there faster. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a complete reference for power users. But you should treat it just as that, a reference, not a primary learning tool, because users will not read instructions as a primary mode of learning. So since we can't get people to read, we often try show and tell instead, maybe using this guy, Al Gore, the one-time presidential candidate. He wrote a book called Our Choice, and it's been adapted into an ebook with a really smart, button-free, entirely gestural interface. And the interface is largely self-explanatory, but Al, as usual, takes no chances and launches into it with this video.
This app is a new kind of book that combines text and images, as well as video, interactive infographics, and my own audio commentary.
You should know he has a reputation for being a little wooden. I don't get it. I don't know.
You can browse through the different chapters by swiping through the visual table of contents, or browse through a chapter by scrolling through the pages at the bottom. To start reading, use 2 fingers to pop a page open. To go back to the table of contents, just pinch the page down. You'll find images, movies, and interactive infographics resting on the pages throughout the app. You can pick anything up using 2 fingers and pop it open. Tap the globe in the corner to see a photo's location on an interactive map. Pinch to return to the page you were reading. Movies work the same way.
Most modern wind turbines consist of a large.
Some images unfold to reveal the other half. Some photos have audio commentary.
Industrial agriculture now uses 10 calories of wind.
A hand icon marks our choices interactive infographics. Pop one open and use your finger to explore the data. I hope that you will enjoy this new reading experience.
Well, me too, Alex. You just sucked the joy out of my first 2 minutes. Look, on the one hand, right, these things are a lot of great interactions here. Most of them pretty self-explanatory, no buttons, sort of nothing else going on. But still, some of the more complex interactions will need to be explained. Thing is, it's like everybody does screencasts, and nobody watches them, except for nerds like us, you know? Complex actions are going to need that sort of instruction, but I think that that can come in a lot of forms, not just in a lecture or an instruction manual. I think it's worth remembering that the best interfaces, you know, require no instruction at all. Now, nature itself doesn't have any labels, and neither do most of the best interfaces. In nature, when you do something wrong, usually nothing happens at all, right? You sort of push on that pull door, and then you sort of figure out that, you know, sort of how it works instead. So sort of the basic sort of physics and everything, the things that we do out in the world are things that we sort of sort out. Now, it's not an easy interface. Nature is a really complex interface. That's why toddlers look like morons all the time, because they haven't learned to use this interface yet, right? They're still sort of figuring it out. It takes a few years. But since we've accumulated that knowledge of the physical world, of how the physical world works, that's sort of something that is deeply ingrained in us and that we're able to use as interface designers to help people figure stuff out. So if done right, and that's a big if, realistic 3D interfaces can help there. They invite touch, they encourage emotional attachment. So if you consider sort of the look of a well-loved leather journal, or for example, and this is certainly a route that Apple has gone very strongly, you get that emotional attachment, but more than that, it's not just, ooh, I want to touch that. The interface should be giving you instruction about how to touch it because of how it's like a physical object. So Apple, with its human interface guidelines for iPad, really pushes this strongly. Make it realistic. This is something that will warm your users to your app and will sort of help them use it. Things you got to do a lot more than just throw sort of some Photoshop textures or a piece of ragged paper at the top of your notepad to make this work. And Apple's own apps show the hazards of this. Calendar app, right? It's a lovely date book, very pretty. And until iOS 5 came out, just what's it been now, 2 months ago, for the first year and a half, you would try to use it like a date book, which is, you know, by turning the page, right? Huh. Yeah. One sec. Yeah, no, nothing. Doesn't work. Instead, you have to hit this tiny little button here to turn the page, right? You have to embrace your interface metaphor. If you're going to make it look like a book, you have to make it act like one. The Contacts app is even worse. You know, here, swiping doesn't turn a page. It actually starts deleting content. Oh, thanks, Apple. That's great. So here, this is like actual misdirection, right? The interface says, this is a book. You know, we use stunts like this all the time, both in print and on desktop, where it's just eye candy, sort of harmless enough. But suddenly, this is that psychological trick that happens when we're doing it with touch. We have entirely different expectations of how that physicality works. So if you go this route of picking a physical, sort of making a physical metaphor of aping an object, you have to embrace that metaphor. You know, think hard about the new interaction opportunities, not only that it proposes, but that it promises. So as I mentioned before, in user testing, I see this all the time. If it looks like a physical object, people are going to act on it like one. So you have to follow through. Don't make me tap buttons if the interface suggests otherwise. On the other hand, right, we have like things like magazine apps, which are too literal, basically PDFs. So they're easy to use, you know how to use them, you just sort of linearly kind of go through a page at a time. And a lot of these things, they even make the table of contents kind of hard to find. But this takes away sort of the whole advantage of digital content, which is random access to content, being able to jump sort of anywhere into it. So you've got these magazine apps, for example, that are just sort of too rigidly following their interaction metaphors, the magazine, but ignoring the potential of digital, ignoring interaction possibilities. Where you have things like calendar and contacts, which are very true in the sort of physical sense to the original artifact, but sort of ignore or follow through on those interactions half-heartedly. So my point is to sort of, as you embrace these realistic interfaces, don't forget to enable what digital media does best, which is to unshackle us from these really linear experiences. Just an example of I think, sort of how that works sort of nicely is in the Sydney Morning Herald. They make a thing that looks very much like a newspaper, and sort of you can flip through the day's issue as you would expect by swiping through it. But also they have these page indicators at the bottom that show your progress through there. Normally, in most page indicators, they don't do anything. But here they have a little shortcut where if you touch it, it shows all of the headlines on that page. So you can really sort of scan quickly through the entire issue. So you have these advantages of this familiar newspaper that's appropriate to the iPad's kind of contemplative, lean-back mode of sort of relaxing reading. But then you also have this sort of more twitchy web-style interface to get quickly to any issue. So the thing is, like I said, there's sort of some confusion here about how to handle these interaction things. And it's partly because the tablet in particular comes from all these different things. It's not the web, it's not a physical paper or artifact, it's not the desktop, it's not the phone, yet it suggests elements of all of them, right? Which means that we've got great opportunities here, lots of tradition to draw from, but we have to be careful about mixed metaphors. Sometimes you've just got the wrong metaphor. And sort of pick on Apple again. This is their voice memo app. Beautiful, right? Look at this lovely retro microphone. But what do I do with it? Do I talk into it? No, the microphone's down here. It's already sort of pointing me in the wrong direction. Can I touch it to do something? Nothing. This whole app, the entire purpose of it is to start and stop recording. But that whole interaction happens right here. It would be a better interface. How about a giant record button, right? And use the whole screen as an interaction. Again, this kind of eye candy, something that's fine to do on the desktop or in print, but suggests something entirely different when you put it into a handheld device. I think it's useful to sort of model your apps to help people learn the same way that they learn in the real world. I mean, right from our earliest days, we rely on physical hints about how something works, and then we verify it through the feedback that the world gives us about it. Watch how toddlers use the iPad. I mean, before I mentioned that they're sort of like little morons trying to figure out the world, but they're a lot smarter about than we are with these touch screens, right? I mean, who's seen a kid play with an iPad? At least on YouTube, right? And they got cats up playing with iPads on YouTube. Everybody can play with these things. But it's like they get it, right? Immediately, this idea of how can I manipulate this content as a physical object, they will figure that stuff out immediately. How do I swipe? What do I press? What do I drag? What do I stretch? They won't figure out your app's multi-level menu navigation, but then again, neither will your adult users, so that's all right. Seriously, get a 3-year-old and make that kid your beta tester, because they're better at this than we are. They haven't yet been poisoned by 30 years of desktop GUI interfaces. You know, think about when you design something. How can I make this? Again, buttons aren't terrible, but do I have the opportunity to do this a different way? Sort of represent my content, my interaction as a physical object. How would a 3-year-old understand this? They might not know what your app does, but would they figure out how to manipulate that thing? It's not a bad starting place for this. So I think it's useful to think of yourself as a parent when you're building these interfaces. Not that you treat your users as helpless babies, I don't think you should patronize to them or condescend to them that way. But just have the same patience and empathy that you would when you're explaining the world to a child. They haven't seen this before, so go gently. And so at last, as promised, how do you teach these invisible gestures? I think on that note, it's useful to look at how we learn to use games and toys as kids. So this, by the way, is my homework for you guys. I want you to go to work tomorrow, fire up some video games, and tell your boss that you're doing research, because you are. Video games are fantastic at teaching this kinds of stuff, right? A lot of games you don't even know what your goal is. You don't even know what you're supposed to do there. You certainly don't know the different actions that you can take. You don't know sort of the obstacles that you're going to encounter. And the way that you learn it is the game sort of gently takes you through one challenge at a time. And the game itself teaches you, either by explicit direction or by demonstration, that you're encouraged to practice through levels. And this is the way I think that we need to design more apps, because game designers are way ahead of traditional software designers at teaching people the interactions that are completely unfamiliar and differ from game to game. So how do they do it? Well, among other things, video games use these 3 tools to teach us with visuals and experiences. I should mention that every modern theory of learning emphasizes the importance of active participation, of active discovery, supplemented by coaching and mentoring. So let me sort of start with coaching. Coaching is just simple demonstration, right? Prompts to tell you what to do. This is the game riding along with the player, the app riding along with the user. We learn by doing, right? And we learn best in the moment. Telling people how is not nearly as effective as coaching them through. And that's particularly true of sort of physical actions. It's worth remembering that gestures, we're trying to get that muscle memory thing going, right? When you think about teaching physical actions, teaching music, teaching a tennis serve, you can't do that in text. You got to show somebody and then let them practice it. Encourage them to practice it, and hopefully deliver them some success as quickly as possible so they don't sort of get kind of down about it. This is how we learn. So help me in the moment. Show me. That's what games do. This is a game called Dead Space for iPad. And this is the very first screen. What it does is it sort of shows you this little overlay on the guy. This is how you move your guy. Straight, back, side to side. A little bit of text control there. And it waits for you. Nothing's going to happen until you figure it out. And then once you do, this coaching goes away, and the tutorial doesn't happen again. A lot of times when we try to do this stuff in software, we keep showing people how to do stuff over and over again. Once you've learned how to do it, you can stop. No need in sort of pounding them over the head with, here are the arrow controls. They've demonstrated they've used it, waited to see that they have learned it before we proceed, and then tutorial's done, right? And you do see the coaching throughout, on the web here. This is Gmail showing a new feature, and you see these a lot of times in sort of getting started apps. And when done correctly, without sort of overwhelming you too much, and particularly when showing it to you in the context of an action you're doing, that can be really useful. And you don't want to front load your app with this stuff too much. Better to show when it's actually relevant, and you're in the middle of that action. A few of you might be getting a little squirmy, because this might remind you of a rather famous UI flop, a flop called Clippy. The problem with Clippy wasn't the idea of an assistant coming up. The problem with Clippy was that he was so stupid, right? He only had the dopiest advice for you to help you with the most inane things. As a result, it was never helpful, just slowing you down. Again, kind of condescending to you. Now, done right, though, this assistant feature, like you see in Gmail or Facebook or in so many games, can be helpful to give information at appropriate times and even emphasize the personality of your app. Take this guy, for example. You guys know this guy? It's Crazy Dave! Crazy Dave from Plants vs. Zombies. So he pops up really frequently, right? To explain story twists or kind of give you missions or introduce micro games. Now he's entertaining and he's useful and he appears for only very short periods of time, which is really important. Don't overdo it. Respect people's time. Don't make them read for long. Let them get to the action. In fact, if you can avoid words with your coaching, so much the better. Simple animations can do the job. This is delivery status touch, again for the iPad. And there's a thing that can happen when you put in your delivery information, a tracking code. it's an Amazon code. Things might come in more than one shipment, in which case they'll sort of say, this is the first of several, and it gives you a little cue here, whenever, the first time that you hit that thing, to sort of show you that there's, oh, you do a little double tap here to get that. So it's a quick thing that, again, only comes up when you need it. It's sort of a little bit of a call to action to do it. And they do it for you until you've actually demonstrated that you've got it, right? This is an important thing, I think, this idea of demonstrating, sort of cueing people until they do it themselves. It's a USA Today app, and it came out very early on in the App Store. It's already looking a bit dated here. But they did something that Facebook, the very first version of Facebook did in their app, was to do content navigation through this dial at the top, a non-standard control in iOS. And you can see there's a little L here, that's the life section. And they sort of hoped that that, along with this little bevel and arrow, would be enough to cue people that there was sort of something there. But they heard from lots of people that were like, where's the missing content? Didn't realize that that was something that moved. So they made a small change that really fixed that, which is that every time you visited this screen, this would zip in from the right. If it moves, maybe I can move it really fast. I mean, less than a quarter of a second. But enough to sort of catch your eye and understand that that is something that is not a permanent fixed thing. And people started using it. And they did it, they just kept animating it until somebody actually did it themselves. And once they did it, they're like, okay, great, lesson learned. Don't have to show that anymore. So an important component of coaching is that you don't teach everything all at once either. You know, we learn best by getting it in doses. You build on the basics, and then you reveal more as you go. So if you're teaching a kid football, right, you don't give her the whole 300-page rule manual. You teach her a little kick, a little juggling, right? You sort of build on these skills until you get there as they're needed. So you want to ease players into the game, and you want to ease users into the app, introducing one element at a time. You know, we encourage people to master the controls and features little by little. You know, the best time to learn a skill, or at least when we're most motivated, is the moment that we discover when it's needed. It's like in the Matrix, when Trinity is like, I need to fly an Apache helicopter now. See, that's a great learning moment, right? You could use that information right now. So that's when we're most motivated and most engaged. Like, for example, when you encounter a gigantic and hugely scary guy with a giant sword. So this is Infinity Blade for iPad. It's got this crazy sophisticated combat system that's all gesture-based and buttons and sort of, it's all over the place. It's complicated. So the way that they do it is they teach you just one of these skills at a time, introducing challenges that are specifically designed to test these skills. So the game pauses itself right here at an extremely convenient moment to say, hey, did you know that you can block by holding this? And it waits until you do, and then you do it, and what do you know? You blocked. Your very first interaction with that is a success. And now you're ready to try it yourself, right? So in games, levels that introduce a new feature should focus on teaching that feature. And likewise, when people first encounter a feature in your app is when you should offer coaching. And like I've sort of said a couple of times, in some very important cases, you should even interrupt people to force them to demonstrate that they've learned something before continuing. So that's what Infinity Blade does over and over again, pausing at incredibly convenient moments to teach you to use a move to beat your opponent. And it waits until you demonstrate that you understand, and again, the first time is always a success. OS X Lion actually uses this right when you install it. So, as probably a lot of you know, OS X Lion changed the way that scrolling worked. You know, so that you're actually now swiping on the touchpad in the opposite direction. So they turned gravity upside down in this, right? It's a big change. So when you first install it, there's a little window that says, hey, we've made this change. Scroll here to try it out. And you have to scroll down to get to the continue button, right? So it requires you to demonstrate that you've learned this significant change in the operating system before you can even use the operating system through this very sort of simple gimmick. And boom, you just beat the first level of OS X Lion. It's worth thinking about your apps in terms of levels like this. You know, what's level 1 in your app? How do you introduce people to new levels of features and skills? Often we do just one level. some sort of welcome screen. And then we release people into the cold wilderness of our software. And think about the whole journey from novice to expert to master. Where can you help people level up? Again, games are great at this. This overlay in the very first and simplest level of cut the rope tells you the basic move of the game. The whole idea is to get this little treat into this guy's mouth. And it tells you what to do. Slide your finger to cut the rope. And it drops right in. So again, this not only explains the basic game mechanic in the simplest possible way, but you're guaranteed to get it right. And then sort of as you go, these levels sort of build on things and gradually teach you new things, steady little demonstrations that coach you through. So here now it's trapped in a bubble, so if you pop the bubble, then it will come down, then you can cut the rope to sort of do it in. So it's this sort of gradual addition of skills. So the whole concept of levels is about evolving from beginner to expert, and expertise is where the fancy moves come in. These are the power-ups, right? These are the super mushrooms in Super Mario Brothers that give you some kind of superpower, right? Power-ups turbo boost your game. They give you shortcuts or some other advantage. Power-ups are the keyboard shortcuts of video games. They're usable by anyone, but especially efficient in the hands of an expert. And that's what gestures are too. I said this earlier. Gestures are the keyboard shortcuts of touch. It's the real advantage of gestures. They let you move quickly through the interface, quickly and natural, without sort of mashing buttons. So creating shortcuts for time-consuming actions, that's the motivation behind most common gestures in nearly all non-game apps. In the desktop world, right, keyboard shortcuts are all labeled. There's a visual cue here. The trouble, an easy reference. And of course, the trouble with gestures, we've been saying, is that they're invisible. So if we add that, 5-finger touch or that 3-finger gesture, that's the only way you can do something, people are going to be trapped, right? Because they're not going to have any sort of visual cue unless you show them. And as I've said, you should stage that info over time. So that means that for most gestures, as I said earlier, you should offer the same options through visible controls. Adding a shortcut doesn't mean that you should eliminate the long way around, in other words. So sort of to look at an example of this, I want to look at Twitter and Facebook and how they offer sort of shortcuts while they sort of force you to learn the long way around, but then there are sort of shortcuts built in. So this is the older version of Twitter, the one that was current as of about 2 weeks ago. The thing about Twitter, right, is that you can really drill down deeply into content, as we saw earlier with the iPad app. So I'm here, I go to this tweet, I want to find out about Kim. Let's see what she's been tweeting lately. Yeah, what's going on here? Oh, there's a link. Now I'm really far down, right? Really far down into the app, and the only visible way to get back is by pounding this back button. Those are garbage taps. It's retracing your steps. There's no sort of value in that, except for sort of seeing where you've come from. And so I should say there is actually value in that, right? I mean, it reinforces your mental model of how the app works. So there's some utility in having somebody do that a few times, maybe. But after a while, it gets kind of old, right? So the old Twitter gave you this swipe that you could zip back to the top. Most people didn't know about it. Somebody at Twitter last week told me that 50% of the company didn't know that shortcut existed. So it had a discoverability problem. It's this hidden affordance as power shortcut, which is great if you knew about it and you were somebody who did sort of go really deeply in there. You could zip all the way back. But it was a problem. Facebook, this is sort of also their most recent app before their current version, also you had a similar thing where you could kind of go pretty far deep down. They had a different shortcut. You could tap the title in the navigation bar to zip back out to the home screen here. So here you had two really big, influential, popular apps trying to solve a very common problem, which is that in a lot of apps you go way down the rabbit hole and kind of can't find your way back up without going this slow way. But they were using different gestures. And while I think that it's something that is a problem that needs to be solved, there's no standard for it, and most users didn't know about either of those gestures in either case. It would have been nice if at least they were using the same gesture, right? When Facebook came out, of this latest version, they changed around the navigation structure. So you would tap this button to get at the sort of top-level navigation. You can tap it again to go back. But look what happens when you drill down. As you go down into this, Look at her photo, there's some comments, great. Now we're pretty far down, and that menu button went away, right? Now it's just a back button. So we're sort of back to where we were. But look, if you swipe across it, you can get right back to that top level navigation, and tapping any of these will take you back to the top of that navigation. Well, that's great, right? So for a few weeks, we had both of these things using the same gesture, which sort of promised to be a useful shortcut, maybe for all of iOS. When you have two really influential apps like this, that you can sort of get that thing going. Oh, but then, you know what happened is Twitter released its app last week. And as you go into it, same problem, right? Okay, great. Well, we know what to do. We can just sort of swipe across. Oh man, not again, right? No, so that's gone now. And what you have to do instead is you have to tap this. And that zips you all the way back out to the top. Now, I think that they were trying to tackle a discoverability problem here, right? Which is that people didn't figure out how to do this. But at least here's a label. And you see this as a reasonable amount of standard for tab bar-based apps and iPhone, is that you can tap this, sort of go back to the top. But what about for other apps that don't use the tab bar? I think that there's real utility in having people being able to swipe across the top like that in whatever app that they're in. You know, so I would have loved to see Twitter, and even just put that back in, and see more apps starting to use that gesture shortcut. If you guys have an app where you can drill down deeply, I encourage you to use that swipe across the tab bar to do it. Because the problem here is if a single tap, this area of the screen, the bottom of the screen is a area where you see a lot of mistaps, where your thumb naturally comes to rest. There's a lot of traffic down there especially for Android, where you've usually got stacked controls because of the hardware buttons down here. So actually, having sort of a single tap button here that will rewind your whole history with no way to get back to it is a kind of data loss. It's kind of like also in iOS, you've got this thing that's built into the system, and so it works in most apps, where if you tap on the status bar here, it zips you all the way up to the top. I see this a lot in user testing, and people don't know about that. They aren't necessarily the power users. They'll hit it by accident, and they freak out about it. They lost their place. So a swipe, this is sort of something that's really useful to know about swipes. It's a great form of defensive design. It's hard to do by accident. It takes some intention. It's not a difficult thing to do. It sort of takes some intention. So sort of single tap gestures. You want to be careful if those are things that you can't undo, like both of these examples show. Swipe is kind of better to sort of require more of that intention. A couple things that I did like in the new Twitter app, though, is they introduced a couple of gestures. If you followed this at all, like a lot of people didn't like, especially sort of power users, didn't like the new Twitter app because things that were once core features for the way that they use the app have been sort of deprecated, pushed down into the app further. So direct messages and switching accounts both are now inside this Me tab. So to ease the pain, they added these gestures where you can swipe across the bottom of the tab bar there from the Me tab over to get to this sort of switch accounts screen, and then swipe it back to go back. You can also swipe up to get your direct messages. So there's sort of a shortcut that they're putting in. Watch, by the way, what happens if you try to swipe down. Oh, whoops, you get the notification center. So we'll get rid of that. And the way that you get rid of it is by tapping the done button. What this sort of shows, by the way, it's interesting that these gestures start on the Me tab, because that's where these things live. But it's actually even better that they're corner gestures. There's things that you swipe from the corner. Because both on the desktop as well as on these touchscreen interfaces, corners are sort of more generous places to hit. They're easier places to start. And so with the gestures that do that, these corner gestures are quite useful. Just keep in mind that at the top, you don't want to do vertical gestures, because on both Android and iPhone, the top is a really busy area. There's a lot of interaction that happens there. So sort of reserve that for swiping left and right, and for iOS, I would say, make that for zipping back to the top of the screen. All right, but again, the discoverability problem, right? A lot of people aren't going to find this, just like they couldn't find the swiping shortcut. So we need to help people to find that stuff. As I said, there's real value in sort of learning how to do it, but then after you've done it a few times, show me the shortcut. That's the power up. Achievement unlocked. You've learned to do it the slow way. You've demonstrated, say, 5 times, that you found this direct messages button. Now give me the shortcut. So that's powering up, right? It's showing the shortcut, but also, again, using this idea of levels. as you explore using some of these new touch-based gestures, I would encourage all of you in your apps to think about multi-touch. Not so much for phones, where I think they're of limited utility, but for tablets, for larger screens. The reason that they aren't great for phones is because to use multi-touch, more than one finger on a phone, you can't really do it one-handed, unless you're holding it in some kind of crazy claw, right? And basically, one-handed phone use is one thumb tapping. So that means that you're putting people into two hands, and because it's a small screen, people tend not to experiment with multi-touch modes, beyond sort of the pinch. But you'll see that for a lot of people, they'll prefer the double tap to zoom in, rather than switching to two hands to pinch. It's sort of as beloved as that pinch and spread gesture is. On the iPad and other tablets, though, it's like you're pretty much obliged to use the thing with two hands, which means that you've always got one hand free to do sort of multi-touch gestures. So in a very real way, the iPad is the very first really mainstream multi-touch device we've got that we can sort of start to encourage people to do stuff. Now the thing is that, like I said before, the conventions don't really exist yet for multi-touch gestures. So how do we teach people how to do it? What does it even look like? Well, I think that apps like Uzu can help to explore that. So Uzu is an iPad app. It's a kinetic multi-touch particle visualizer, which is basically like a lava lamp. It's like a little tool to hypnotize stoners. I understand this city has some experience with that. But that's what it might seem like, right? So the developer put together a 10-minute demo, and I sort of crunched it down as best I could to give you a sense of it. I hope you'll bear with me, because I think it's got some interesting lessons.
The first is the single finger mode, and you can just sort of run your finger around the screen, and particles will spawn where your finger is. And if you hold it still, it will kind of radiate like this, and you can sort of move your finger around. And so you can use big gestures, or you can use very small movements. The very small movements can create different effects. And throughout Uzu, the gestures can be big and dramatic, and they can also be very subtle to create different effects. So let's move on to two fingers. When you do two fingers, you're going to get this sort of attractive area like this. And it'll get bigger and smaller depending on how wide you go. And you can do fun things like put the fingers out here and grab all of them, collect them, and sort of start to move it around. And of course, the faster you move it, the different color particles will move to the outside, which is a lot of fun. You can use this to collect fireballs and throw them, and all sorts of things. Let's move on to three fingers. When we put three fingers down, we're going to get this sort of vortex thing. It's kind of fun. So 5 fingers. Now this is where it gets interesting. You can grab the whole thing with your hand like this and sort of move it around. And you'll notice that it moves sort of in a 3D perspective here. You can throw it, stop it, move it around. This is one of my favorites. This is sort of the grab them and throw them mode. So you can be in any of these other modes, say like 3 fingers. I'm going to put 2 fingers down, and it freezes it, and I can move it around in 3D space and throw it. I can do that from any of the other modes. I can go into the 5-finger mode and freeze it and move it around, which is a lot of fun to do, to sort of get the thing in the different shapes and freeze them and then see what you have. At 7 fingers, we have the spiral. Now, the spiral is kind of interesting. If we get our hand sort of centered here, the spiral will also react to the same type of interaction that the 6-finger mode reacts to, in that you'll be able to expand and compress to get different things to happen, and then also translate to offset the various curves. And then from here, if you can, of course, you can lift 2 fingers, go right in that 5-finger mode, check your spiral out. That's kind of fun. And then make it go again. You can sort of do this even while you're moving it around. All right, 9 fingers, we get a little different. We do this, and now each finger sort of gets its own little, I don't even know what to call this shape. Some people have called it a little butterfly, a little springy rubber band thing. We're going to go into 10 fingers. 10 fingers is where you're going to control the color and the size of the particles. At 10 fingers, you notice everything just freezes. Let me get a nice shape and see if I can transition it. We're going to go down. Well, it makes it freak out a little bit. So we're going to slide forwards and back to change the hue, and left and right with our hands to change the size. So go something big and blue. And we can play with it. And we can just do this on the fly. You can just, whenever you want, grab with both hands, change the color, change the particle size.
So you're like, wow, all right, Josh, that's great, but how does that help me with my financial services back in something, something? Look, Uzu's a toy, but at times, right, it seemed more like it was a musical instrument, right? Like he was playing it more than he was using it. And I think that this is sort of something to think about, that as we explore how we can use multi-touch gestures as kind of a shortcut layer on top of our apps, that gives us the opportunity to make software that we play more than we use. You know, again, it's sort of looking at all of you with keyboards. Look how quickly and fluidly you get that, where you sort of prefer actually not to use the interface sometimes, right? Keyboard shortcuts. That's why people who are into keyboard shortcuts love keyboard shortcuts, because they never have to take their hands off the keyboard. So imagine sort of the possibilities of how you can manipulate content in your app using something like this. 10 modes, 10 fingers, right? I mean, that's how that works there. Including in some ways that are sort of unexpected, you know? Changing the hue and particle size. We've solved that problem. You know how to do that. That's probably a slider, 2 sliders, right? Well, why not sort of have a shortcut that you can also sort of manipulate that stuff on the screen itself, you know? I've talked a lot about mimicking physical interfaces to give cues about how we use touchscreen apps, but you know, training users to do this is not necessarily obvious. You know, how do people figure out those 10-finger things? One is that this app in particular, it's fun and it's silly and it encourages exploration, right? And I gave this to some friends of mine, have a 4-year-old daughter, and she picked it up in about 20 minutes, figured out all the different interactions. Kids love this, by the way. It's great with like 2 or 3 people too, because you can sort of interact with this stuff. But it encourages exploration and it rewards discovery. If you think about how we use our own tools, all of us have something that we are ostensibly expert in. You know, you might be great at Illustrator or Xcode or whatever. And then somebody comes up behind you and you're like, oh, you're doing it that way? Have you tried this? And you're like, whoa, you just blew my mind. And it's like this real sort of sense of satisfaction, like learning something new. And so I think don't be afraid of introducing complexity, of introducing these kind of gesture shortcuts. Because as long as you introduce it all at the right time, through demonstration, through animation, through hints and cues, you know, people are going to really respond to that engagement in the way that we all do when we learn something new that helps us be more awesome, as long as we don't have to read the instructions, right? So toys like this are useful. You know, toys are how we teach children to interact with the world, to teach cause and effect. So I think that toys like Uzu can also teach us to use these devices and gestures too, to sort of train ourselves in a new culture and a gesture vocabulary. But I think that all of this means that it's more important than ever to share, to have events like this where we come together and talk about the stuff that we're trying out. Because this is another salt and pepper problem, right? We don't yet have standard social conventions for all these UI gestures, you know? You can't even read different magazines on the iPad using the same gestures, right? It's like I don't know how to use it. It's like learning something new every time. Which means that we need to talk more. To have events like this, competing companies, their designers and developers should talk. Stuff like this isn't new science. This is like just agreeing on how to read a magazine would be a useful start. I think it's also important that we can't sort of assume that anyone has really nailed it or tested it or thought about it to sort of say, oh, these big guys, the New York Times are doing it this way. They must have tested it. I know the people who make the New York Times apps, and they haven't. They're flying by the seat of their pants like everybody else, right? I mean, so it's important to have these conversations. You see something you admire, you've got a question about, pick up the phone. Send an email to that designer or developer. All of us like to talk about the work that we've done and the decisions that went into it. So sort of be willing to sort of do that sharing. It's a time to be generous. That's a really exciting time. I mean, new platforms don't come along very often. You know, we're just inventing what these things can do and what these interfaces look like. All of us in this room. You know, we're like inventing the future at a time which is, frankly, one of the most exciting periods in the history of technology and possibly of culture. And so it's important to try new things. Throw everything we've got at the drawing board, but also to be aware that our enthusiasm for the new is also sometimes maybe an Achilles heel. So we also have to have some sober moments to ask ourselves and each other, you know, does this thing make sense? Is it a good idea? Also ask that toddler, 3-year-olds, I swear to God, best beta testers ever. So designers just need to know this, is all I'm saying, is that insightful work is part technical know-how, but empathy and imagination and an expansive worldview, that's what generates breakthroughs. It's like I said, we've got the coolest job in the world. We really are. We're inventing the future here. And so I just want to ask you guys to go out and make something amazing. Thanks.